Hi everyone, I am so excited that I'm finally recording this video where I'm going to walk you through the process that I personally use to prepare for job interviews. Now this process is very adaptable, and I'm saying this because I have literally used this process for every single role that I've secured in my career, from working in consulting to working in the federal government to spending some time in entertainment and now to my role in tech. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, or if you want to hear more about it, I encourage you to keep listening, because like I said, I'm going to dive in deep to the process that I personally take or use to prepare for every single one of my job interviews. Now, quick disclaimer, like I said, this is my personal process. This is literally just what has worked for me and has proven successful through the course of my career. So I am excited to finally share it with you all. I'm hoping there are pieces of it that you can, take and use and alter it however you would like. But yeah, so I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right in to how I prepare for my job interviews. So step one, I typically start by looking up behavioral questions for the specific role that I'm interviewing for. Now, I start off with behavioral questions because these are very commonly asked. If you have several rounds of interviews, at least one or two of them are going to include some behavioral questions just to gauge how you basically handle situations or act in a specific, environment or whatever the case may be. So to do this, I just start by researching, looking up online. I'll literally go on Google and I will look up behavioral questions for insert role. Now, the wonderful and most beautiful thing about the internet is that there's so much information on there, but the overwhelming thing about the internet is that there's so much information on there, right? So likely when you search for this, you're gonna get back several results with so many questions that you're gonna feel a bit overwhelmed. So I'm gonna just reel that feeling of overwhelmingness, if that's even a word, in to just let you know that I have a specific source that I've honestly loved and used a lot for behavioral questions. So if you do that search, I would encourage you to click on the source or the search result that comes back from the Muse. I'll put a link below for what that may look like, but this is honestly a website or a source that I have used for all of the jobs that I've interviewed for, and oftentimes a lot of the questions on there are actually asked during the interview. So I do love this source, and I encourage you, if you're doing that search, to click on that one as a starting point. Not saying you shouldn't trust the others. So yeah, I start by looking up those questions, and then from there, again, even clicking on that link, you'll see at least 50 to 100 questions listed, behavioral questions for that specific role. So that still is a bit overwhelming. So what I do next is I pull up the job description and I basically just analyze it really closely to understand what kind of scenarios I might find myself in my day-to-day role. What kind of stakeholders am I going to collaborate with, right? Am I going to need to learn how to manage conflict? Am I going to need to learn how to manage up? Things like that you can kind of slightly tell from the job description. That's what I do. I then look at that list and begin to cut it down. In addition to that, there are several different ways that you can word the same thing, or basically you could ask the same question a million different ways. So what I do is I search for redundancies and questions that seem like they actually do align to the role that I'm interviewing for. This just means they're worded differently, but they mean the same thing. So once I've done that, my list is typically short at this point. I might have 5 to 10 questions. And from there, I would still cut it down a bit more because preparing for 10 behavioral questions is quite a bit. So I would limit it to about 4 or 5 questions tops, 4 or 5, I don't know. But yeah, so once I've done that for behavioral questions, I move on to more specific questions, which I will refer to as role-related questions. So these are questions that are directly related to the role that you're interviewing for. It's going to talk about, skill sets, software, technologies, whatever it is that you need to bring to the table to be able to do the work and make an impact. That's what those role-related questions are trying to get at. So to do this, the website that I absolutely adore, live by, and have always used to prepare for these types of questions is Glassdoor. I don't know if you use Glassdoor. I don't know if you're aware of it. If not, Glassdoor is amazing. I will encourage you to, take a look, try it out. and just see the kind of information that's on there. But just a quick plug on what's on there. There's salary information, there's benefits information, there's information like job interview questions that I just mentioned earlier, and there's also company ratings. And the reason why I really like Glassdoor is because all of the information on there is entered in by employees or former employees. So that means the questions that are on there have been asked before, right? So like 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a similar question or something along that same vein. So that's why I love using Glassdoor, because it at least gives me an idea of the types of questions that have been asked by that company for that role in the past. And I can use that as my starting point to prepare for these interview questions. So again, similar to what I said earlier with the behavioral questions, it's possible that you might have like over 20 questions that come back that are different. So I would encourage you to do the same thing that I mentioned for the behavioral questions, which is basically to refer back to the job description and look at the specific things that are needed to get your job done, similar to what you did for the behavioral exercise. So you're looking at tools that are needed, technologies that are needed. You're looking at collaborations, partnerships, like who will you be working with, what's the audience, and things like that. This will allow you to cut that list down. And the reason why I'm saying this for role specific is because there are some titles that are very broad. For example, the title of a business analyst. That is very broad, and like the type of work you do as a business analyst can vary from team to team. So just because you see that a business analyst was asked a specific question on Glassdoor doesn't mean that you're going to be asked that same question or even something similar, because the subject matter or the type of work could just be very, very different. So I encourage you again to make sure that you're cross-referencing the job description to make sure that whatever it is that you're preparing for or writing down or documenting is actually relevant to the role that you're interviewing for. Now, there are some instances where you might search on Glassdoor for the role in the company, right, that you're interviewing for to find interview questions, and nothing comes up, which just means no one has entered in any interview questions yet. In those scenarios, don't fret. Like, I typically recommend looking up questions from similar companies in the same role. For example, if I was interviewing for a business analyst role at Google and I searched on Glassdoor business analyst interview questions at Google, or I searched on Google, typically I would search on Google business analyst interview questions at Google Glassdoor, because then it'll just take me to Glassdoor. But yeah, if I do that search and I click the link for Glassdoor and I see that there's really no questions, I will then search business analyst interview questions, Microsoft or Facebook, Glassdoor, right? Like, so that I can get those questions from a company that's in the same industry, because chances are like the questions that they'll ask will be pretty similar. So yeah, don't fret. Like, if you don't see anything for the company you're interviewing for, look for a different company, but in the same industry, right? You want to make sure that the type of work they're doing is very similar so that you're not comparing apples to oranges and preparing for the wrong thing. So yeah, start off with researching behavioral questions, whittle that list down, move on to researching role-specific questions, whittle that list down. And once I have my list, it's typically about 4 to 5 behavioral questions, 4 to 5 role-related questions. I then move on to assigning themes to each of these questions. And when I say theme, basically all I mean is when I look at the question, I think to myself, okay, on the surface, this question says this, but at the core, what is the interviewer actually trying to find out from me, right? A theme could be leadership. It could be communication, it could be time management. There's so many things that could be the underlying theme. So I encourage you to read each question and really think about that a bit, right? Like, what is the key takeaway here? Yes, I can explain that I've done this before and how I've done it, but have I driven home the main message, which is around like, how did I manage up to get this done, right? Or how did I communicate to get this done? Or how did I collaborate to get this done? Those are the themes that will help you to take your answer from good to great. So that's one of the reasons why I assign themes. The other reason is because, like I said, there are a million different ways to ask the same question. So you don't want to be in a situation where you've prepared your list of questions and that's like all you're sticking to. And when you get asked a question that's similar but different during the interview, you kind of freeze up and feel like you have no answers. The theme allows you to have almost like a repository to dip into and tap into. So for example, if I have questions that have time management theme, leadership theme, collaboration theme, working cross-functionally, things like that, when I'm asked a question on the spot that may not necessarily be how I wrote it out or one of the questions I prepared for, I will immediately start troubleshooting in my mind and assigning a theme on the spot, right? So if they ask me a question and I'm like, oh, leadership, then that reminds me that I could just use one of my leadership examples or answers that I prepared for during my interview prep sessions by myself. So hopefully that makes sense to you all, but for me, that has really helped me and kept me from like drawing blanks or feeling like I have no relevant answers, because for the same way you can ask a question several different ways, you can share an example several different ways as well. There are projects that you could talk about that you could highlight your communication more, or you could highlight your leadership skills more, or you could highlight your ability to for proper time management more. There are different ways that you could kind of set up your answers. So these themes will allow you to kind of weave your answers accordingly. So I encourage you to assign themes to your answers, because that is just, it's been great for me. It's really helped me out. So after assigning themes, this is when I start to craft my answers. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the STAR method. I think this is a great method, using the STAR method. If not, I will provide a description of what the STAR method is below. But for my answers, I kind of just go from the vein of issue. So I'll say, this is what happened, like this is the reason why I either had this project, or who wanted this project, or what I was doing. This is the issue I was trying to solve. Solution is next. So this is the solution that I personally contributed, right? This was my role in solving this issue. Solution, right? So this was what I did to basically resolve that issue or problem. And then impact, that's what you land on. This was how it benefited the company, the team, the business, whatever it is. There should always be an impact at the end of that example. So you can use STAR, or if it's easier to just remember issue, solution, impact, use that as well. This is the issue that was at hand. This is a solution that I personally came up with or contributed to resolve the issue that I explained earlier. And this is the impact that it had on the business, on the team, or just writ large on the company, right? So that's kind of how I prepare my answers. Now, this part that I'm about to say is just, you can take it or leave it. But for me, when I'm writing down answers, I typically will have 2 to 3 answers for each question. 2 to 3 different answers for each question. Yes, different answers. And the reason why I do that is because I have a serious fear of drawing a blank. And that is because that has happened to me before. So I have literally drawn a blank during an interview. And that feeling is a bit gut-wrenching. Like, I felt like I couldn't even piece together sentences after that happened. So I come up with at least 3 solid examples, still in that same issue, solution, impact framework. And that is because I feel like if I'm asked a question that's similar to what I've prepared for, if I don't remember the first example I wrote down, I'll at least remember the second one. If I don't remember the second one, I'll remember the third. And if I forget all 3, then I wasn't preparing for this interview. Like, that just shouldn't happen. So I highly recommend writing down at least 3 solid examples highlighting the issue, the solution, the impact of everything that you've worked on, or not everything you've worked on, sorry, but all the answers that you're providing during the interview. Another core thing to remember, I said issue, solution, and impact, so I felt like this might be implied, but I think I should just state it very clearly and explicitly, is that for role-related interview questions, you should always make sure that your answers are anchored to a solid example. And when I say example, I mean literally explaining the work you've done, what your role in it was, who the audience was, why you did that work, how it impacted the business. It is your time to literally tell a story and showcase your skill set, right? So there are several ways you can answer an interview question. For example, if you're asked to tell me about a time where you delivered or you managed a project under a short timeline, you could give a really quick answer like, yeah, so I've actually done that for a project while I was at this company. You know, it was supposed to be due on X date, but because I was able to collaborate with different people, it got done sooner. What would make that answer stronger is to talk about, just paint the whole picture, because that will help the interviewer to really understand the role that you played in that situation and the value that you brought to the team or to the project or just to the company. So rather than just saying, yes, I've done this and it ended up being successful, you need to say, yes, I've done this and I did this because the company was undergoing changes or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, paint the full picture from beginning to end. Talk about the audiences, talk about who you collaborated with, talk about the outcome, talk about the impact. Like, when you're giving your interview answers, I cannot stress this enough because I think this is the most important piece, but it is literally making sure that your answers are anchored to an example, right? So you explaining something that you have specifically done to solve whatever it is that they're asking, or, just your specific contribution. How did I make this thing come to pass? And then just making sure, in addition to giving your example, that you're thinking of the issue, the solution, and the impact. You don't want to be vague. Like, this is your time to be as specific and detailed as possible. But just make sure, right, that, like, obviously it's good to give a lot of detail, but if your answer is going on to be like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that's way too long. You shouldn't be talking for that long. So I would definitely say, like, give detail, but at the same time, be mindful of how much time the interviewer actually has to speak with you. So yeah, after you've crafted your answers, the next step is kind of a no-brainer. You just need to practice, right? So, like, practice in the mirror, practice with a friend, just practice in general. That way you feel more comfortable saying your answers out loud and it feels less rehearsed and it begins to feel natural. So one thing that I do, and I do this actually for the mock interviews that I conduct with my clients, but if I don't have anyone to interview me, I will literally just record myself, interview myself, and record myself. And the reason why I record myself is because it allows me to listen back to it and pay attention to certain things that are like maybe tics or things that I didn't know were like my shortfalls, and I realize that when I'm listening to the recording. For example, using filler words or speaking too quickly or just not being comfortable with silence, right? Like, there's just so many things that you may not realize you're doing during an interview. So that's why I encourage you, if you don't have people to practice with, or if you do have people to practice with but you are a bit uncomfortable doing so, just record yourself and listen back to it. Take yourself out of your own shoes, right? And just pay attention to your answers, pay attention to how you're conducting yourself, pay attention to how you're actually even just putting your answers out there, because all of that matters. It's not just about what you're saying, it's also about how you're saying it. And another great thing about recording your answers and listening back to it is it allows you to think of follow-up questions that interviewers might ask you. So you may prepare your examples and feel like, oh yeah, like, I'm gonna crush this. This example is very specific, it's very detailed, it's very to the point. But if you haven't anticipated that, like, you might say something in your answer that would spur different conversation. For example, if you say, like, yeah, so if the question was about, getting a leader to agree with like a recommendation or something that you gave, if your answer maybe was around like, yes, I've done this before, I met with my leader, I used some data or whatever to kind of show them my point of view, and they agreed, immediately, right? Like, they got my perspective, they agreed with me, and we were able to move forward with like my recommendation. They may ask you a question like, so what would you have done if they didn't agree immediately, right? Like, these are things to just think about and prepare an answer for. They may not ask that, but you just don't want to be ever caught off guard. So just think through any follow-up questions that could come from like the answers that you've given. Also, just think through any gaps that might be in your answers as well. Put yourself outside of your own shoes. If you didn't know yourself, if you didn't know the work that you've done, and that interview answer that you wrote down was read back to you by someone else, like someone else told you that, is there any additional detail that you would need to better understand what their role was, or to better understand what their contribution was, what the impact was, or what they did? Like, these are big things to think about, because oftentimes we forget that the interviewers do not know us and they don't know our world or the work that we've done. So this means that it is our job to make that very clear to them. So if you're still thinking with basically being in your own shoes, that sometimes can be a roadblock, right? Because at that point, you're forgetting that this person doesn't know you, and like the details that you're like, oh yeah, like you assume there's just such minor details that obviously the person would know it. They actually don't. So go into the interview remembering that this person does not know you. They don't know what you do. Even though, yes, they have your resume, they may not have even looked at it yet. So consider that as well. Just go in there as if they've literally never seen your resume. That way, you're not leaving off any minor details that actually are a pretty big deal in the eyes of the interviewer. So yeah, that's kind of long story short. I don't know how long this was, if I can call it long story short, but how I prepare, I'm just going to run down the list one more time. So I start by looking up behavioral questions. I move on to whittling that list down of behavioral questions based on what I see in the job description. I move on to the more role-related specific questions, which again, I pull those from Glassdoor. After looking those up, I do the same thing I did with the behavioral questions, where I look at the job description and whittle that list down as well to make sure that the questions that I'm actually preparing for are relevant to the team, to the work that I'm going to be doing. From there, I assign themes to each of these questions to help me with recall so that I could quickly assign a theme on the spot when I'm being asked a question if it wasn't something that I actually had already prepared for. And then also just so that I can get to the core, or the meat of what the interviewer is looking for, and not just looking at the question at the surface. From there, I write down 2 to 3 examples for each of the interview questions that I've come up with. And again, like I said earlier, always make sure that your answers are anchored or rooted strongly. The foundation of your answer should be an example. It should be you telling a story of a project that you've worked on, a product you developed, or whatever the case may be, from start to finish, right? Like you need to make sure that you're telling them what the issue was, what your specific contribution to a solution was, and what the impact of that work that you did or the product you developed or whatever it is had on the team or the company. So yeah, these are the steps. I don't remember, that might be like 5 steps that I use, 5, but I hope that you found this helpful. This is not necessarily the whole like preparing for a technical interview. If you're interested in hearing how I prepare for technical interviews, which are typically like a coding challenge or something like that, let me know in a message or in the comments, and I'll be happy to work on some content for that. But I hope this was helpful. Like I said earlier, this is my personal process. I have used this across a number of different roles, a number of different industries, and it has never failed me. So I hope that it helps you as well. Like I said, you don't have to follow it by the book. Take a few pieces here and there and like make them work for you however they will or however they do. So that is all that I have for you today. I hope that you found it helpful. If there's anything else that you want me to talk about, like I've said before, just leave me a comment, send me a message. I am much obliged to actually work on creating that content for you. So have a wonderful day, workshoppers. Thank you so much for listening.